I wrote a fantasy trilogy that I considered gritty and honest and character focused. I just thought it was an epic fantasy trilogy in the finest traditions of epic fantasy. And then everyone said it was dangerous and subversive.
Hello and welcome to Wizards, Warriors and Words, a fantasy writing advice podcast. I'm Jed Herne, author of Across the Broken Stars, and I'm joined by my fellow writers, starting with Dirk Ashton.
I am Dirk Ashton, not Michael R. Fletcher, no matter what everybody says. And I wrote this, not him. This is the first book of the Paternus Trilogy.
Is that the version with my name on it, though?
No,
is that the one? Does my name?
This one has.
Or is that the one where you replaced my blurb?
Yeah,
this is the
other motherfucker. Sorry, this is the one with Mike Carey.
You're such a shit. You traded me for a different Mike.
I love my
Mike.
That
upscaled. I guess has introduced you sufficiently.
I guess.
And Rob J. Hayes.
Hello, I'm Rob J. Hayes. I'm author of, we'll go with The War Eternal, including this one. This is book 3. I don't know where book 1 is. It's around.
That looks awesome. That's from Cold Ashes Risen. And we are joined again by the wonderful Joe Abercrombie. Joe, welcome back.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You did well on last episode, so we thought we'd let you back in again. You know, we knew you were beating down the studio doors to get in. So
I've been out there all week.
That's right.
Just waiting for the doors to open.
Haven't had time to go home and change clothes.
No,
Neither of us have, actually. Yeah. So yeah, we thought we'd just do another kind of random questions episode because that was really fun last week. So I guess I have a bad habit of starting off with big questions that are way too ambitious, but how do you deal with like the pressure of being in what most people would probably consider like the top, 2, 3 or 5 fantasy authors working today? Like, how do you deal with that pressure?
Well, I mean, I suppose I don't necessarily see it that way. Probably is one thing.
It's true.
That helps.
Yeah. I mean, it depends how you define fantasy, doesn't it? If you define it in a very narrow kind of, particularly epic fantasy, probably gritty, grimdark kind of styly, then you're still stretching it. But if you think of, writers like J.K. Rowling and Neil Gaiman and George Martin, and then, a lot of writers at the more kind of YA end, there's a lot of writers selling a lot more books than me, I would have thought.
Sure.
Not that I wish to deny my own huge importance, of course.
I was going to say, don't pass up this opportunity here, Joe.
No. And, not that many writers are able to make a full-time living out of it. So I feel constantly lucky and blessed to be among those chosen few up here on the Mount Olympus of writing, where we spend our time above the clouds.
You had a weird effect on fantasy. I mean, you mentioned the word grimdark. You literally fucked up my genre. I wrote a dark fantasy book, which I was quite proud of. And then you came along and bang, it's fucking grimdark now. And I'm like, what? The fuck is that?
Label change.
And now I'm a grimdark author. And I'm like, nobody even asked me. And,
I'm coming for your genre, motherfucker.
You did that.
Yeah, I didn't deliberately do that. I mean, the same thing happened to me. I wrote a fantasy trilogy that I considered gritty and honest and character focused. I just thought it was an epic fantasy trilogy in the finest traditions of epic fantasy. And then everyone said it was dangerous and subversive.
Yeah.
And the whole grimdark thing. I mean, no one used grimdark until years after the first law was out. I mean, that's probably, I first heard it 2008, 9, 10 kind of time. And back then it was usually meant pejoratively to mean this book is a turd. It meant,
it's gross. It's gross and violent.
It's gross. It's gross in a kind of utterly over the top, risibly childish, edgelordy way. Is what people meant by grimdark. They meant this is rubbish. They would say things like, the first law is grimdark, but Game of Thrones isn't because it's good.
No,
that was the difference. That was the difference. No one considered a Game of Thrones as part of grimdark. originally. Then gradually,
now everyone's going back and relabeling shit like Michael Moorcock, Elric books, or Grimdark.
Yeah,
you can't go back. That's fucking dark fantasy. You're not allowed to retroactively label things.
Well, the same true first law.
Dark fantasy is all werewolves and vampires and sexy people in naked, half-naked covers. So you have to.
It's true. Sexy dinosaurs.
Yeah,
and all that.
Is that a sneak preview of your next book, Joe Abercrombie? Sexy dinosaurs and werewolves.
Would you pay for sexy dinosaurs?
Yeah, probably.
It has Joe Abercrombie's name on it. I guess so.
Yeah. There are werewolves.
Chuck Tingle beat you to it, Joe. Sorry.
Chuck Tingle beat everyone to it.
Yeah. to all of them. So what is this book that you're working on, Joe? I should know this, but...
A seamless transition.
Yeah,
it's a set of pages with words on them. This is the basic idea. It's a sort of a new thing. I'm in that phase. We were talking last time about how little I enjoy the drafting process, and I'm kind of getting towards 3/4 of the way through the draft. So this is the long night before the dawn, I hope. But it's a sort of a new thing, different world. It's a kind of ridiculous version of our world. Alternate history is doing it way too much of a favor. It's just kind of nonsense that I have bundled together in order to create a tapestry on which my ridiculous characters can engage in their blood-spattered drama.
Is it a trilogy?
And it has werewolves.
It does have werewolves. It has werewolves. It has vampires. It has wizards, and all kinds of.
Does it have a 10-year-old pope in it as well?
It has a 10-year-old pope.
There we go.
Yeah,
nice.
Is it a trilogy? Do you think?
I don't know. It's sort of designed to be like detective stories. Each
sort of
book is its own thing.
Okay.
That features some of the same characters, and the characters tackling a different mystery or mess or problem. The basic idea is that the Pope has a set of monsters in her basement that are sent to deal with the problems that the righteous don't have the skills for.
That's cool.
That is basically the idea.
I like it.
So there's an oversexed werewolf. There's an ancient vampire. There's a self-obsessed wizard. There's a knight who can't die. There's an invisible elf. And various.
You just rewritten the Suicide Squad, but with like vampires and werewolves and the Pope.
But better.
They stole it off me. But I mean, you just said that the Suicide Squad doesn't have werewolves, vampires, or popes. So fuck that.
That's right.
That's not my jam.
You heard it here first. That'll be on the back of the book. If you enjoyed Suicide Squad, well, this is not really the same thing, but read it anyway.
I mean, rewriting classic stuff with fantasy kind of dressing on top is not a new thing, even for me.
No.
So, yes, that is kind of what I'm doing, I guess.
You got that. With your last trilogy, I was particularly, not just because it was, of course, I was excited because it was the next Joe Abercrombie thing. But you got a special, pretty wonderful deal where you were able to write at least the first draft of all 3 books before the first book came out, which is incredibly rare. Kind of deal. Are you doing the same thing with this, or just kind of going one at a time?
Whoa, what is that?
Wow.
That
are you getting thunder? Oh, what?
Wow.
I have a lightning storm happening right outside my house.
Oh my god. That's very atmospheric.
It's my fury at being likened to the Suicide Squad.
I was going to say, Joe has cursed you.
Is raining down on me.
If Rob dies tomorrow, we know who the culprit was.
Age of Madness, I had... We kind of... Well, I've got a close relationship with my editor, Gillian Redfern, who's fantastic, who I've worked with right from the start at Galance, and I sort of felt that, obviously, I'd written the first law, and I'd written 2 books before the first one was sold, more or less. And by the time the first one came out, I'd pretty much finished the whole lot. And that kind of gave me the chance to revise the first book at least a bit, with the end of the third book very much in mind. And I feel like it wouldn't be half as good if I hadn't had that opportunity. That was quite important, because I wanted to, if you're doing a proper trilogy, you want it to be, for me, one story in 3 parts that has some weight and, things that start and pay off at the end, and callbacks at the end that refer to the beginning. And it wants to have a shape, to the whole thing, and really to be written like one book in a sense. And so I'd then written 3 standalone books, and I'd written the 3 Shattered Sea books, which are much shorter and more self-contained in a way. They're like 3 stories that add together into one, but they're not massively linked. So when I was going to write The Age of Madness, I felt, well, this is another big single story, really. And if I'm going to do the best story I can, I kind of need to get to the end before going back to the start, because I can't write a really good start without knowing what the end is in the end.
Yes.
So that felt the best thing to do. And it also, when writing the standalones, I'd kind of run into production problems a bit. Not terribly badly, but just, missing a deadline by a couple of months. And, I'm not someone who kind of disappears off the face of the earth, then turns up in the office with a briefcase full of handwritten notes or whatever 3 months later. When was the date again? I'm pretty organized. I'm pretty on it generally. So, my editors knows exactly where I'm at. And so sometime, a year before the book was due to come out, I kind of knew, I don't think I'm going to make this date. And so we had to shift things back a bit. And that causes a bit of a pain in the arse internally. And, when you're doing a big series, there's a rhythm, ideally, to keep to if you're going to have the best result. You can't be blind to the business side of it. You're supplying a product. You want the publisher to be able to deliver to the booksellers. You want the readers to get it when they want it, And it seemed to us that yearly would be the best outcome. And I don't quite write that fast, I write maybe a book every year and a half, maybe, on average. So it seemed like a better thing to take a break, get a really loose draft of the whole series in place, and then schedule them for publication, because we'd kind of know, once the first draft's there, I know I can do it, within a certain time frame and get the books all ready. So that's kind of what I pitched to my editor and to the publisher, and they were happy to do that. They saw the sense of it. I mean, I felt like it was better to wait 2 or 3 years and then publish yearly and get the best possible result creatively and hopefully commercially, than to kind of always be chasing your tail trying to get the next book out and potentially land yourself in a mess because you've written something in the first book and suddenly, as you're writing the third, you think, shit, I wish I'd been able to do this or that, or change that character, or do that thing that way.
Been there.
Exactly. You want it to fit together. And so I had that luxury, fortunately. I mean, what happened was I wrote the first book, and then, having written the first book, rewrote it a bit, because I kind of felt, by the time I got to the end of the first book, I already had then a pretty good handle on it. And so I rewrote the first book and then wrote the other 2. And as I say, they came pretty quickly, pretty relatively easily. Nothing's ever easy, but relatively easily. And then once we had, drafts of those 2, I felt like, okay, stick it in for publication, tighten the first one up, and then revise and tighten the other 2. And that's kind of what we did. And it worked really well. For this latest set of books, the plan was to write something where I can just do a book in this series and then go away and then come back and do another, and then go away and come back and do another, or do 3, or whatever suits, because I've got various other stuff going on. So I did when I was writing Age of Madness as well, and it slightly got in the way at times. The problem with something like Age of Madness, it's so big and there's so many characters and there's so much going on and there's so much history and other stuff to draw on from the other books. You've kind of really got to have your head in the game to make headway. There's a lot to keep in the head. Whereas with these books, I want something that I can kind of dip into a bit more, and not worry too much about continuity and, try to make everything pay off smoothly. So with these ones, it won't be that approach. I'll get the first one done, then we'll publish, then we'll see where we're at, and I'll write them when I can.
Are they shorter too?
They're always supposed to be shorter. Every book I write is going to be shorter. So when I set out to write Best Served Cold, that was going to be, so the first law were kind of 200,000 ish. Last Argument of Kings was longer. I think it's about 240. It's my longest book, I think. And then with the standalones, it was like, okay, let's pull that in a little bit, make these a little bit shorter. 150, 175, that was the plan. And then it wasn't. It was like 230 or something.
Sprawls out.
It sprawled out. It bloated it kind of was left out in the rain and swelled up to 230,000 words, Best Served Cold. Then Heroes I got down to 200, and Red Country I finally got to like 180. That was actually the length they were all supposed to be. Age of Madness wasn't too bad. I think they were all more or less where I hoped they'd
or so, right?
Yeah, well, they're sort of, I think they're between 180 and 200, 175 to 200. Nice. They're around there.
And for those listening, we're talking about word counts, not pages.
Yes. Not pages, yeah.
I don't think in pages because
the book could be nice and tight.
The hardcovers are always a different number of pages than the paperback, so I think in words always for length. Yeah.
Nice. One thing I wanted to ask: there are if a book has just one scene and the rest is a slog or crap, yours aren't that way. Just let's get this straight. I will love them forever. And there are two particular scenes like that where in the first law, one is in the first book and one I think is in the second. It's been a long time since I read them. You ever read a particular chapter or portion of a book and suddenly everything, it's like the prose, the mood, the subject matter, and everything just comes together in a way that makes you kind of go, there are two, which is very rare for any one author, in one series. One of them is when Logan first becomes Ninefingers.
Yes.
In First Law, or in the first book. And I just was going, because everything, I mean, the voice changed, everything, this big badass guy who's kicking the shit out of him suddenly is like a 3-year-old standing in front of a giant. And another, and I can't remember exactly which book it's in. It's very simple. Logan is in a wagon traveling with some other soldiers somewhere through the hills and the forest. And then there's an attack going on. Logan slips out, makes his way through the trees, and forgive me, I'm terrible with names. The big bad guy that he ends up fighting in the end with the half-tattooed character.
The Feared.
That whole scene, even before that's just the way he was thinking and how you described how he was sneaking through those trees and taking people out, was another one of those where I was just like, ugh. And I wanted to ask if you thought that way when you were writing those, or once you wrote it, you thought, okay, that's a really fucking good scene. Do those stand out to you like they do to me?
Certainly the first one. I mean, partly because, obviously the thing with the Bloody Nine is like quite a big thing in the books and has been trailed a lot, and kind of, the powder has been kept dry on that. So it was it was satisfying to do that scene. And it was a scene I thought about a lot how to do. And voice to take and refined a lot, and kind
the
of
execution was perfect. You know, that those kinds of reveals are tough because they can fall flat, but yours was just perfect, on point.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was one that worked really well, and that obviously worked exactly the way I'd planned to. The other one you mentioned is interesting because that's one of those emergent things that just happens while you're writing sometimes, that I hadn't really, it wasn't like a major...
No. Yeah,
blip.
Nothing really major happens. He doesn't even fight that guy or anything. But there's something about the way you wrote that just still sticks with me, and it's been a lot of years since I read it.
Yeah, sometimes things just kind of work. As I was saying before, sometimes, you know, you just write something without really thinking about it. You don't even necessarily think much of it, and then when you come back to it and you're revising, you think, oh, this is very close to right. I mean, Dogman's stuff, he's one of the characters in the First Law. I always kind of wrote that and then deliberately didn't really polish it because it kind of felt better to be sort of rough and raw and a bit like a guy telling you the story in a pub. You know, that's kind of the feel that I wanted it to have.
Sense. Yeah.
Other things I spend a lot more time kind of revising and polishing, but it's always great when, you know, stuff just happens and
comes together.
Yeah, and sometimes stuff you'll work on, you know, you'll grind it out and you'll think this is rubbish. Then you'll read it the next day and you'll be kind of, wow, man, if I cut that paragraph and stick that one there, suddenly
that's
this is
not
brilliant.
so bad. Yeah.
Yeah. And then other times you spend a lot of time trying to get things exactly the way they are. So it varies. And sometimes, you know, you read things 10 years later and you think, man, that is a brilliant scene that I never really thought much about at the time. And sometimes you read things 10 years later and think, I loved that. Yeah. And now I'm not sure it lands the way I wanted it to.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You know, it's very odd. And people sometimes ask, you know, would you rewrite? Would you re-edit? Would you do a new edition? And it's sort of occasionally something I've thought about because there's things that didn't work or that I wish I'd done better with or I could have done differently, you know. But the thing is, when do you stop the clock and say, right, I'm mature now. Now I know the way to do it. Because in 10 years more, perhaps I'll look back and think, no, you know what? I was right the first time. I think a book's got to be a sort of testament of the person you were when you wrote it.
Nice.
That's well said. I think that way lies madness. Trying to go back and tweak with stuff.
You never finish a novel. You reach a point where you're like, you either don't know what else to do or you got to do something else now.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you give up on it. You're like, fuck this, I'm done.
Yeah, it can always be endlessly revised more and more and refined more and more. But I think I've reached a point now where I've quite a structured set of revisions that I do. And once I'm through that, I let it go apart from the kind of proofread and things like that, because you do have to leave it alone. You know, it's massively diminishing returns, and even reaches a point where you can't really tell. You're as likely to introduce mistakes as you are to solve problems, I think.
Do you turn into George Lucas, in other words?
Possible. We all turn into George Lucas at the end.
Eventually. We'll get there.
Die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become George Lucas.
Dirk, you were asking something?
Do you revise in phases, Joe? Do you concentrate on one thing, like voice, and then pacing, then characterization?
Yeah, very, very much I do. Or I have come to. I didn't always. I used to just go over and over and over and over and over things endlessly when I first started writing, just because I was experimenting with how to do it and, you know, what to leave in, what to cut out, how to redo things. And I'd start every writing session by reading what I wrote the last time and rewriting it. And then I'd kind of end every session by going over what I'd written and rewriting it. And then over time, I became kind of more efficient. And these days I tend to smash through a first draft. I was saying I split things into parts. So each of the Age of Madness books is in 3 parts, and I'll write a part and then I'll revise it in some detail and get it into a kind of readable state.
Interesting.
And then send it to an editor, my editor, discuss it. Often I discuss it with my mum and dad as well. Nice. They still read my stuff and are brutally critical of it, which is great. And I'll discuss it with people, and I won't change it again then, but I'll have in mind some things that maybe as I go on to the next part, need to be different or, have a different idea about. And then when I get to the end of a first draft, again, discuss it with the editor. But a lot of, we'll kind of have discussed it quite a lot already. So in a way, at the end of the first draft, there's not that much to say sometimes. So we've already talked about it. We know what needs doing. And then second draft is really the heavy lifting of refining the characters, getting the arcs right, maybe adding a chapter or taking something out here or there that is something that needs developing a little bit more or expanding on. And, making the big changes that make it hopefully make sense and pay off. Does a character need to be more caring early on so that their twist to being more cynical is more effective, that kind of thing. And try to pull out the voices of the main characters as much as possible, though I'm doing that all the time. So that's kind of at the forefront of my mind all the time. So hopefully by this point, the voices are quite established of the main characters. And then when I've done that second draft, I kind of have three big passes through, where the first is really focused on character, probably more the secondary characters than the primaries at this point, because the primaries should be there. But the secondary characters try to get as much kind of personality and distinctiveness into their manner and their voice and the way they talk as I can. So, I tend to, when I first write a first draft, I'll use sort of generic things, a lot of eyebrows, a lot of raising eyebrows, eyebrows all over the place in my first drafts. And then, you think to yourself, right, what's a bit of a more specific thing to this character? Are they twitchy? Do they rattle their heel when they're waiting to talk? Do they sniff? Have they got one eye higher than the other? What is it about them that is kind of distinctive and speaks to their personality? Do they tug on their beard hairs? Do they pick their ear while they're waiting for things to happen? Try to find things that are arresting. And
do they finger their scar?
Exactly. And things like, what trying to get consistency in their, what do they wear? What do they look like? What's their hair like? Are the things that have changed during the course of the thing. So, for instance, Rika in Age of Madness is a character who's physically undergoing quite a lot of transformation as you go. So you kind of want to keep coming back to those things. And she has these twitchy kind of mannerisms that you're trying to maintain. And, other characters have a certain way of talking, a certain dialect that you're trying to sharpen up and get as consistent and correct as you can. So that's really what that pass is about. And then there's a pass that is setting focused. Some of that is kind of trying to get research stuff that I've dug out of books into the text to make the kind of background rich, the sort of world building-y things. Mm-hmm. I'm not too arsed about that stuff generally, but where it kind of adds some texture and something arresting and interesting, you're looking for those details that bring it to life. Like I was reading Engels' Condition of the Working Class in Britain, as you do. And he was observing that,
reading.
Of course, he was observing that the slums of Manchester were full of pigs. Like the streets, the alleys were all rammed with pigs. Everyone would have their pigs that they'd feed the rubbish to, and then in winter you slaughter your pigs, and there you go. So the slums were just a constant screaming bedlam of pig noises,
and smelled good too.
Exactly. And that's just quite a kind of, wow, I never thought of that. When I watched David Copperfield,
very vivid detail.
They don't have pigs everywhere, but they did have pigs everywhere in the Victorian slums. So, that's the kind of thing you add and think, oh, that brings the scene suddenly to life. So there's that kind of thing, but then also there's the sort of detail of how the scenes are constructed. I tell you, I might often write a conversation in a room, and there is no texture or personality to the room. So this is the point at which I say, what kind of room is this? What makes this scene unique and interesting in the same way that I'm trying to make the characters unique and interesting? What's the weather like? What's the light like? What's the temperature like? What time of year is it? Are the leaves falling from the trees or are the leaves springing out, And does that bring anything out from the characters? Does that bring any observation? Does that kind of add to their character? So, for instance, in Trouble with Peace, there's a scene where Savine overhears this conversation that Leo and Lord Isher are having in the next room. And in the first draft or second draft, that was just a room. But by this draft, it is a room with hunting trophies everywhere, right? So it's a kind of manly man's room of the kind that Leo might have, with these overbearing stuffed heads everywhere. Says something about him, but she then is kind of, it becomes modeled as a hunt that she's on to kind of snare them. And so the hunting trophies around the room take on a slightly different tone. She looks at the sort of a deer with horns, and that gives her a certain thought. She looks at a big cat, that gives her a different thought. So it kind of, that adds a sort of, it adds a tone to the room, makes the world feel kind of richer and more lived in, but also adds something extra to the characters. So I'm looking for that sort of thing, and to try and give everything a little bit of a theme and a little bit of texture. It doesn't have to be much. It's just a line here or there that takes it from nothing to something. Mm-hmm. And then the third big pass through is just language. And I've got an incredibly clever thing that I do, which is I make the text really big. Like really big. So I've got a big monitor.
What size font are we talking here? 20?
Oh, we're talking like 400% on Word. It's not the font. I'm just blowing
just zooming in.
The zoom it in so that the text looks big, and that gives you a different look on it. You can make it a different font sometimes as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done that in the past, and it's huge. It's really useful.
It makes it, suddenly you read it differently, different things stand out. And also when you type, you feel really powerful because the words are massive. So that's good.
I have become a god in the word processor.
That might be the best advice I've ever heard for writing. Just type in a really big font so you feel good about yourself.
If you want to be a big author, type in big text.
Exactly. One of the biggest names in fantasy. It's 11 letters, Abercrombie.
That's it. It's just about stretching it.
So, yeah, exactly. So I'm going over the detail and just trying to get pick better words, get the rhythm of the sentences right. Words. The bestest words, the finest verbiage available to man. And, move the commas around, all of that stuff. And to get the sort of balance and the rhythm, and take what is bland filler that I've stuck in for one reason or another, and try and give it a bit of personality and balance and rhythm, and those things that I suppose I think of as good writing. Of course, no one ever really agrees on what good writing is, but what I think of as good writing anyway, that's what I'm trying to impose as much as possible in that third round, and that's it. Once that's done, it goes off to be for its final edit, generally. And nice. The proofread and the kind of, those last couple of bits.
Thanks for sharing that process. That's
great.
A really good way of looking at it. And I will be stealing that wholeheartedly with my next book that I edit. So.
I mean, I think it's good to try different stuff as well. I tend to do slightly different things with every book. And sometimes some things feel like they work, and sometimes not so much. I mean, some chapters might need some extra going over because they're a bit of a mess. And some chapters sometimes they need a theme. The chapter does, and sometimes you can find a title that gives you a theme that then brings other things out.
Right.
And often chapters that have different points of view within them, it's nice to link them through in some way that kind of gives you a sense of
cohesion,
continuity, and that your book's actually about something rather than just a load of stuff you wrote. It's helpful as well if you can manage it.
Always a good illusion to have. This has been amazing. We'll wrap this up in a second, but I just wondered if there was a couple of rapid fire things that I could go through with you. Just feel free to just shoot out the first thing that comes to your mind with this. First of all,
or just go next question.
Yes, reject it if you want another question. Okay. What is the worst writing advice anyone has ever given you?
The worst writing advice anyone's ever given you?
Like you specifically. Is there something that someone said to you that you tried to incorporate and then you look back on it and thought, oh, that was a mistake?
Well, I think there are writing cliches that are only ever half right. Show don't tell is kind of half right, but it's also bollocks.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Write what you know is kind of true, but kind of hugely limiting as well, because you've got to write what you don't know at some point. Or you just write you. I just write a guy sitting in a room writing. which is not very interesting. You've got to write what you don't know.
Spillian Swarbeck was pretty good in Age of Madness. I thought he was great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a little authorial self-insert is always nice, isn't it? So I think any advice is always both right and wrong. You know, don't stick too much to any advice you get, because you've got to find your own way through it in the end. Use what works and throw the rest away.
Yeah, I like that.
Awesome.
Next one is, if you could have only written one of the First Law standalones, so either Best Served Cold, The Heroes, or Red Country, if you could have only written and published one of those, which one would it have been?
Ooh.
The Heroes.
Yes.
It's actually, over time, has become not hard to answer in a way. I think I really like the other two as well, and like a lot of things about them. But I think The Heroes just hit a sweet spot of my kind of interest in military history and politics and all that stuff, along with the kind of mosaic nature of having a lot of characters and a lot of points of view. And that particular trick you talked about, I think, is sort of just works very well for that particular book and as a way of investigating how a battle works. And it's just a bit more, not that it's never been done before, but that kind of approach of having epic fantasy very compressed in space and time. It all kind of takes place in 3 days in one valley, really. I think is probably my most original book. Not that is necessarily that interesting, that things be original. I think that's kind of overrated. But I think it's my most technically successful book, I think, probably.
I would say it's probably my favorite. Like, I like them all, but that one is the one that blew my mind the most when I was reading it, because of the compressed nature of it and just what you did with all those different viewpoints. So I'm glad you have picked this for the scenario where you travel back in time and delete the two other books. Yes.
Correct.
You have nailed this. You may or may not be able to answer this one. Is Ninefingers alive in Age of Madness?
I generally prefer not to answer that sort of thing, just because I think if it's in the text, it's in the text, and if it's not, why are we talking about it in a way? But I mean, I don't think it's necessary that he be there.
No, I agree. Yeah, fair enough. That's a good answer. It's kind of nice to have these things left up to your own interpretation as a reader as well.
Yeah, I think often it is. Yeah, absolutely. The mystery is important. I think fantasy fans especially often get kind of obsessive about the cataloguing and the rendering into maps and tables. What is better left as magic?
Magic systems.
Well, maybe. I mean, that sort of thing's not my taste generally. You can do it well or you can do it badly, of course, but it's not. I like there to be some doubt in the corners, because that life is full of that, right? Real life is, you never find out the answers to most things. There are no answers.
Yes.
So exactly. I think a book feels more real and honest when it has mysteries with no answers in them.
I like that. That's another good answer. Another pass from Mr. Abercrombie. You will be graded.
We're going to grade him at the end. You scored 7 out of 10. That's 3 answers.
That's
3 out of 4.
All of our podcast guests go home with a report card telling them how well they did. No, okay. Second last one. We're almost done. What advice would you give to an author who is writing their first book right now, and they kind of relate to a lot of the things you were saying about struggling when they're halfway through it? They're really doubting themselves, and it was fun at the start of it, and now it's sort of feeling like a slog. What advice would you give to an author in that situation?
After saying all advice is half shitty,
yes,
what advice would you give?
What half shitty advice would you be giving to the author?
My shitty advice would be chair time. Sit in front of it.
Yep.
You know, they say plants grow in the gardener's shadow, and books grow in the writer's shadow. If you're not in the chair, then it ain't going to happen. So, sit in front of it, read it, do whatever feels the route of least resistance. Don't kind of say, man, this chapter's so hard, I'm going to sit here and smash my head against it until it works. Maybe say, if you're thinking, I can't wait to get to that scene, and write that scene.
Go write it.
Write that scene.
Yep.
And maybe that'll get the juices flowing a little bit, and you'll come back to more difficult things and find they flow out sooner. So take the route of least resistance. I mean, it's not fun writing. It's horrible a lot of the time. But try and make it as fun as you can. Don't make it harder for yourself than you need to.
Yeah.
All right, and last one here. Complete this sentence for me. Say one thing for Joe Abercrombie. Say he's a...
say he's a... I don't know. It's kind of not for me to say that, is it? I don't know how I'd describe myself.
You need an authorial voice to say it for you?
Kind of, it's other people to judge in a way.
That's fair. Rejected question.
That's rejected.
Well, that's kind of like the last time that actually comes up in Logan's chapters. You don't finish it there either, and it's very satisfying how you just sort of leave that blank, and again leave it up to the reader to basically insert whatever they want. So beautiful circularity there. Nice work, Joe.
Oh, thank you.
Another pass. Well done, sir.
This has been great. Another pass. I'm sorry that I turned this into a grading session, but Joe, thanks so much for coming on the show. This has been absolutely spectacular. You're one of my favorite authors, so this means a lot to me, and I've really appreciated all the thoughts you've shared on writing. It's been great.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Really
Thanks,
stuff.
guys.
Really good stuff. Hope to see you in person again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Are you thinking about going to Scotland for Worldcon in 2024? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I probably will go catch COVID again.
Unless I get hit by a car, I will be there.
Yeah, I try to get to the Worldcons that are in Europe, or so Scotland is close enough that I really should try and make it. Yeah.
And you, Rob, you plan on going?
Oh, I'll be there. Yeah, it's like a train journey, so it's like easy enough to do, isn't it?
Yeah. Awesome.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for listening or watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you for listening or watching to this episode of Wizards, Warriors, and Words. If you like what we're doing here and you would like to help support the show, please go to patreon.com/Wizards, Warriors, and Words. And for a monthly subscription, you can get access to bonus episodes that you can't find anywhere else. Currently, we have 5 bonus episodes up there, and we're going to be adding more in the future. So you can check that out. The link is down below if you would like to have a look. And special thanks to our high-tier patrons, Talon, Daniel, and Lewis. Thank you for helping support the show. We'll see you next week.